Resuming debate, the honourable member for Belleuil-Chambly has 7 minutes remaining. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to continue where I left off on the issue of education. It's important to recognize, at risk of repeating myself, to the importance of recognizing the fact that the Liberals have to work with the provinces and territories to make sure they have the resources they need and the plans in place for outreach and education, not just when it comes to using drugs, but also when it comes to drug-impaired driving. But let's move on to something else for a moment, Madam Speaker. Before I go any further, I think it's important to recognize, so important to recognize, despite the fact that certain comments were made this morning in connection with this debate, which virtually insinuated the opposite. All members, regardless of their political stripes, we all agree that impaired driving, whether it's impaired by alcohol or drugs, that's a scourge. It's a scourge we want to eradicate. There's no doubt about that. I think it's like illness. This scourge does not discriminate. Everybody's been affected by it. Everybody's been affected by the tragic mistake a person makes when they drive impaired. And that's important to recognize because we may disagree about how to go about dealing with this problem, but we all agree that we need to do something to make our roads safer.
With this bill is this notion of the mandatory stops and testing, and that's something that came up during the Public Safety Committee hearings on a private member's bill that was tabled by a Conservative member, which sought to do something quite similar. Insofar as the issue here is nothing in life is random, particularly and unfortunately when in some of the work that's done in policing. And so if we're calling on for random mandatory testing, the odds increase exponentially of things like profiling, like people of a specific socioeconomic background being targeted. And that for us as New Democrats is something that we cannot accept. And it's something that I know our leader, Jagmeet Singh, considers is extremely important. It was something that was central to the work that he did in his leadership campaign, but also the work that he now wants to do as leader of the Democratic Party. And something that, as he has said much more eloquently than I could say in this place, he himself, as a person of color, has been victim of. And so I think when we look at the laws that we put in place to ensure public safety, it always needs to be done in a way that ensures that we're not going to be unfairly discriminating against certain populations. And that's not something, certain segments of the population, and that's not something, Madam Speaker, that I'm just pulling out of a hat. That's something that was shared with us by experts at the Public Safety Committee, not on this, specifically on the study of this bill, even though that comment has been raised about this bill by different members of civil society, notably the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and others. It's something that was raised when other bills were tabled, both from private members, but also even when bills were being discussed in the previous Parliament, government bills from the then Conservative government. And so, Madam Speaker, I think when we take this approach, we have to make sure that we're not increasing the risk of a problem that, let's face it, already exists, and that's the problem of racial profiling. So that's one concern that we have, Madam Speaker. L'autre préoccupation que nous avons, c'est la question.
Our other concern is the issue of the quantity of THC or the concentration of THC to constitute an offense. The bill says virtually nothing about that, and it's very worrisome because how do you know if a person's committed an offense, a criminal offense, unless you have a specific level prescribed by law? That's very worrisome, Madam Speaker. Look at the American examples. states where marijuana has been legalized, and you can see that the approach varies. For example, in Colorado and Washington, a level was set. I forget what the precise number was, but blood concentration level was set out specifically in the definition of the criminal offense. In another state in the U.S., Colorado, I believe it was, they decided to leave it more open and do the same kind of standard field test, field sobriety test that they do for drunk drivers. The problem when you have no set level is exacerbated when you consider the lack of police training. And I don't mean to insult our men and women in uniform. They themselves have said this. And this brings me back to the point that the Liberals have really failed to plan things properly. They've decided in principle that marijuana should be legalized, but that requires a lot of planning. They need to work with the police. It seems to me that's obvious. Obviously, extra training was going to be needed. For example, just to recognize whether a person is driving while under the influence of drugs. And, of course, there'd have to be some training on what the field tests would be, what kind of standard field sobriety test. And that's all the more important when there's no set level in the legislation, no measurable set limit. And a Conservative member asked a question earlier and mentioned that in some big cities there are municipal police forces. In Quebec and Ontario, there are provincial police forces, the OPP in Ontario and the SQ in Quebec. And what we see there, and of course there are major city police forces too, and then there's the RCMP in other areas. So there's a whole lot of different police forces at work here, and they may all have different policies and practices. There's a lot of stakeholders involved, a lot of people around the table who might have something to say, and they've all said that there's a lot of work that needs doing, and that hasn't been done yet.
Brought up in committee is the importance of that training and the importance of training police officers to be able to recognize the symptoms and use these technologies. As I was saying, it goes in two directions. First of all, it's obviously essential for public safety so that they can do their jobs properly. That obviously goes without saying, in order to properly identify people who are driving under the influence, but also being able to properly not only convict these people, but also knowing, of course, who isn't driving under the influence or who hasn't reached the legal limit of what they're allowed to either drink or smoke, depending which substance you're dealing with. And so that's also, so it's not only a question of public safety, it's also a question of protecting Canadians' rights and ensuring that, which police officers obviously are willing to do and require the proper training to do it, as they mentioned themselves in committee, the representatives of the chiefs of police, most notably. And Madam Speaker, the issue of training also extends to, as I mentioned, to the technology that's used. Because let's face it, when we hear the experts and when we look at different jurisdictions throughout the world, the jury is still out as to the efficacy of certain tools that can be used to measure, in particular when it comes to marijuana, to measure someone's physical state after consuming marijuana. One great example of that is the fact that, as we heard in committee and as has been mentioned in other platforms, in other spaces over the course of this debate, both here in the House and throughout civil society, is this issue of how long traces of marijuana can be found in someone's system. It could be days, even weeks in some cases, that there still can be traces of marijuana, of THC found in someone's blood. So it's difficult for me to fathom a situation where someone might recreationally use marijuana in a perfectly will then be legal and appropriate way in the privacy of their own home. Will make the responsible decision to save lives and to not go behind the wheel, and then in a couple of days will be driving into work and then potentially be found as a false positive in that particular situation, even though they are no longer actually under the influence and are at 100% of their mental faculties and their physical ability to drive their vehicle without putting anyone's life in danger. That's extremely problematic, Madam Speaker, in particular when you connect that with obviously some of the issues and concerns we have with regards to certain types of profiling that might happen with these random mandatory tests. And so that's certainly something that we're extremely concerned about. Et Madame la Présidente, j'ai entendu la...
And Madam Speaker, I heard the Justice Minister raise this point this morning. She said that there would be a rigorous examination of all the different technologies and the police would participate in that review.
The problem is that this is all happening very quickly without enough consultation, and that means that we're very concerned actually about how effective this technology actually is. One good example of that would be this. For example, oral fluids. A person can go to the police station, and then after there has to be a blood sample. So there are a number of tests that are done, and that actually is proof of the uncertainty surrounding these various kinds of samples that can be taken in order to be able to determine what the state of the person behind the wheel is, depending on the substances in their blood. So that's quite a concern. It's a section that was raised by many experts, and the issue still hasn't been clarified. As I said in English, there's a direct connection between that and profiling. You see, if you stop someone who did consume something beforehand, and if that is a responsible citizen, well, that person may end up being caught up in this whole chain of events that can have serious consequences on their life. It can even lead to time in prison. And legal proceedings are very complicated. They're very lengthy. As a matter of fact, that could be a whole other discussion in itself. That is to say, the legal system. Because we've seen many cases, for example, the Rorden case, where because of, for example, the Rorden ruling, some cases have been actually thrown out. And that's because of delays in the legal system. So there could end up being challenges as well because of this bill. That's another connection one could make because of this ruling. Madam Speaker, the Conservatives speak a lot about mandatory minimum sentences. Under their government, this policy, and elsewhere in the world, was shown to be a failure. That is to say, not allowing a judge to have any discretion over decision-making and being able to look at issues on a case-by-case basis. These are values that we want to make sure are consistent with the Charter. And we think that this runs counter, actually, to the Charter. I know this argument has been brought forward before. I know the Conservatives will oppose Bill C-46 based on this issue of sentencing. But a question was put to the Conservatives earlier on. On the Public Safety Committee, we heard experts, legal experts, and others, for example, psychological experts, speak to us about how people think or actually do not think when they end up impaired behind the wheel.
Something extremely interesting with us. They explained to us that the key that we need to look at as parliamentarians when it comes to this particular issue and dissuading people, because that, after all, has to be the objective here, is we don't want to get into, because if we're not dissuading people, then we're already dealing with the tragic consequences of driving under the influence. So if we don't want to live with those tragic consequences, we need to dissuade people in the first place. The argument is that punishment is one way of doing it, but, Madam Speaker, what these experts told us is that the magnitude of the punishment is not the disincentive to driving under the influence. The true disincentive is the likelihood of getting caught, and that requires resources to the communities, to policing, to education, the things that will allow us to teach these fellow citizens that getting behind the wheel under the influence is obviously not something to do, and you're not only taking your own life in your hands, you're putting other people's lives in danger as well. And this point is extremely important, Madam Speaker, because again, dissuasion, prevention, that's what the objective has to be here, because we don't want to see any more lives lost because of driving under the influence. Donc, dans cet esprit, Madame la Présidente, c'est pour ça qu'on doit investir.
Madam Speaker, that is why we have to invest in education. That is why we have to make sure the police services have the resources they need to do their job. For example, during the holidays, that requires resources. It requires human and financial resources to be able to patrol. All you have to do is look at the numbers. There are many things that can be done to support them. For example, the driving services that are available for people who need to be driven home. And there are many things we can do to deal with impaired driving.
We will oppose Bill C-46 for the reasons I explained, because of the risks of profiling, because we feel these technologies are unreliable to truly measure the level of THC in someone's blood, and because, speaking of THC, the lack of clear number of what the level of THC in someone's blood has to be in order to consider this a criminal offense. But let me be clear, that does not take away from the fact that no matter which party we may be in, we all agree that this is an alarming situation that needs to be dealt with. Et notre position, Madame la Présidente, c'est...
And Madam Speaker, our position is that we need to have enough police resources. We need to put money into education in order to curb this plague of impaired driving. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
And comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his thoughtful speech. One of the things I'm very concerned about is the lack of resources that have been devoted both to get the police ready across the country for the doubling of impaired drug driving that we're likely to see with this legalization of marijuana. The government seems to be very proud about the $161 million that they've given for the police and the $9.8 million for training, but it's a very small amount compared to what has been done in Washington and Colorado, for example, and I wondered if the member shares my concern that not enough resources and time has been allowed.
Honorable député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
And I absolutely share that concern. And it's, as I said at the outset of my speech, one of the issues, the criticisms that we've had of this plan is the failed, perhaps not failed, but certainly inadequate consultations that took place with the provinces when we see how some of them are reacting, particularly when I look at in my home province of Quebec, for example. And that point is even more important when we consider both in Quebec and Ontario, with such large populations, that we have provincial police forces who are obviously going to be ensuring road safety and doing these roadside stops, and they are the first ones. They need to be working with their ministries, obviously provincial ministries, that this federal government seems to have left twisting in the wind. And I would say, Madam Speaker, that I also believe that police officers will be the first ones to sell, the virtues of education as well, of prevention. To think that police officers want to make these arrests, they don't. They, as we do, want to see prevention happen so that we don't see these lives lost in the first place. How will education happen, Madam Speaker? It's hard to say right now, and certainly the provinces will bear a big load of that burden, which is part of the failings the Liberal government has had on this front, despite our support of, more broadly speaking, of legalization.
The honourable member. Thank you. Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Chambly for having spoken about the numerous flaws in Bill C-46. The Liberals want this passed quickly before July 1st. But they're putting the cart before the horse. Those flaws include the lack of resources being put into prevention. Marijuana is consumed between the ages of is the most highly consumed substance between the ages of 16 and 25. And so we have young people using, and the Liberals have refused over and over again to invest more in prevention. But we know there are youth groups calling for more prevention. There are frontline responders asking for more work on prevention. They need more money because there isn't enough. So every time the Liberals talk about legalizing marijuana, young people are thinking, oh, well, if they want to legalize, it must be good for our health. I'm sure there are no risks. There won't be any harmful consequences. However, there are harmful consequences, and young people have to be aware of what those are. But if no funding is attached to that, then they can't. Liberals said they were putting $2 million into substances, but that's for all drugs. In Colorado, $46 million was invested in prevention in 2015 alone. What would my colleague have to say about that? The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her question, and I'd also like to congratulate her on her work on the topic we are speaking about today. She had an opportunity to ask many questions of the government in this House on this very topic, and the answers weren't very convincing, not only in terms of numbers. As I said in my remarks, there's the issue of taxation. You know, a certain percentage of money collected could have been put into education and prevention. There could have been discussions with the provinces to make sure they were doing that. I know the various ministers concerned in Quebec, for example, spoke about education and prevention and pointed out the flaws with respect to that in the legalization plan. Madam Speaker, anything that we do to deal with the impaired driving plague has to go through education. What we want in the end is to not be in a situation where we're just dealing with the consequences of this behavior. The Honourable Member.
Madam Speaker, and again to my honourable colleague, is he aware that there are only 246 days left before this government intends to legalize marijuana? And although I fully agree with what he's saying about us needing a public education program similar to what MAD did to try to reduce drunk driving, the fact remains the RFP for the government's public education plan was due back October 16th, so they could pick a contractor so that they could begin to put together a public education program, which is not going to be ready anytime soon. Was the member aware of this?
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly.
Well, it's certainly an interesting, an important point, Madam Speaker, because again, this is the failing of the approach that the Liberals have taken, where this is a complicated issue. It requires many people around the table, many of whom feel that they either weren't at the table or not there long enough in order to properly execute what needs to be done. And I'll go back to also what we heard from police saying that they need more training, that they want to be able to do the job that they need to do. And as I said in my speech, Madam Speaker, the reason why that's so important is that it's two-pronged. On the one hand, obviously, better police training will go a long way. It goes without saying almost to ensure public safety. But at the same time, if we also want to protect people's rights and making sure we're not getting these false positives and things like that, that's another reason why training is so important. So all these issues, whether it's money, whether it's the education programs, whether it's training, consultations with the provinces, how is it going to be sold, etc., etc. This has been one of the biggest issues with the Liberal government's plan, certainly, and it's been unfortunate that the provinces have been stuck picking up the pieces. Certainly, in most cases we've seen so far, they're doing their darndest, if I can say it that way. But at the same time, it certainly shows a failed approach to the Liberal government. Something they said they would do better.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I had the privilege of sitting at Health Committee while our committee studied Bill C-45, the companion legislation to this that legalizes cannabis. And along with my colleagues, I think we heard time and time again how important it is to base sound policy on facts, on evidence. There's a lot of mythology that has accumulated over the last decades about cannabis in particular. And I think also we heard very clearly that Canadian youth are among the second highest users of cannabis in the world. And in order to actually have an impact on them, we have to learn how to speak properly to them. And I think that starts with giving them information that they find credible. Now, this government has claimed over and over again that they're taking an evidence-based approach to this bill. But so far, I've heard no clear answers on the questions of is finding 2 nanograms of THC in a milliliter of blood, is that truly a sign of impairment? Do we have the equipment that can actually measure it? And their answers, they don't really know. So I don't really know how they can have an evidence-based approach to this bill and at the same time legislate when they really don't have hard science behind them to back it up. I'm wondering if my honourable colleague can comment on that, on whether this legislation will be successful if Canadians, in particular youth, don't find the underlying concepts to actually be legitimate or valid.
L'honorable député de Belleuil-Chambly.
Honourable member for Belleuil-Chambly.
Madam President.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
My colleague for his question, of course, thank him for the great work as well on this file and in committee in particular, because it is a complicated issue, and the question he asks and comments he makes are very interesting and important because I'll admit, Madam Speaker, even I've heard sometimes contradictory information on that in terms of what level of THC in the blood is required in order to have to be in a state of impairment, and in this case, as the case with this bill would be, to lead to impaired driving. And so I think that that's certainly a huge challenge. As my colleague mentioned, the fact that the government doesn't have the answer to that is extremely concerning. And I think the issue here, Madam Speaker, and this again goes back to even the work, and I'll speak as the NDP's public safety critic, even the work that police need to do, because if we're grappling with these issues as legislators, if the government seems to not have the answers, then obviously police are going to need more than that to be, because they as well want that fact-based information. My colleague mentions young people needing credible information. Certainly police, when they're going to be doing the work that would be prescribed to them by a bill like C-46, would also need that kind of credible information. They just don't have it right now. And so I think that the government has a lot of homework to do before we can get this right.
Reprise au débat, resuming debate. The honourable member for